This talk begins with something that has been happening regularly and even constantly ever since I started the Endangered Alphabets project. So many of my talks and presentations have been in small town libraries, especially around the state of Vermont. And many of the people I've presented to have not been scholars or linguists. They've been intelligent, ordinary lay people. And for them, most of the stuff that I've been talking about has been very new. And one of the things that has happened, not only often, but actually invariably, is that I talk about endangered alphabets, minority writing systems from around the world, and introduce them to all these fascinating cultures, etc. And then when the Q&A period comes along, without exception, somebody has said, "What about cursive?" And when this happened at first, I thought, well, these are not specialists. These are people who've slightly misunderstood what I'm talking about. And cursive Latin alphabet. The Latin alphabet is anything but endangered, as we know. So they've kind of missed the point. But this happened over and over and over again. And I started realizing, first of all, this was something that matters tremendously. That people, I'm talking mostly in North America now, but elsewhere as well, feel extremely strongly about the decline in use of handwriting. When they say cursive, they are talking in a somewhat general term, which might mean Palmer method writing, or it might just simply mean writing by hand, in some cases joined up, in some cases not joined up. But this question just kept coming back and back and back. And it led me to start thinking about the materials that have shown up in my new book, By Hand. And when I started thinking about and writing and being interviewed about By Hand, which is a book about handwriting, people said to me, so this is kind of a departure for you, isn't it? You've been doing this endangered alphabet stuff, but now you're talking about handwriting. Is this something new? What promoted this new departure? And I was never quite comfortable with that question. And just in the last 48 hours, I've realized what that strong connection is. And so the talk I'm going to give today is actually really about something slightly different to what you might think. I'm asking the question, is handwriting an endangered alphabet? And again, I'm asking this in a particular way because you're kind of going, wait a second, you could be handwriting in any alphabet. What do you mean, is handwriting an endangered alphabet? And what I have realized, and in part, this is thanks to Jerry Leonidas, who was really the first person I talked to when I was working on the endangered alphabets, who was looking at writing, asking the same questions I was asking. What he said was, there is no script in the world that has been as affected and shaped by the invention of printing more than the Latin alphabet. And the flip side of that is that the scripts that I had been studying and researching and carving through the Endangered Alphabets Project were ones that were the least likely to have been affected by printing and subsequently digitization because they are minority scripts. All of which led me to realize that there is a really, really important subject to be examined here, which is how the scripts that have come to dominate in the world have themselves been transformed by that position of dominance. So I'm thinking, for example, about the British arriving or bringing printing presses into India in the mid-19th century. So straight away, that caused a major divide between the languages and scripts that were deemed worth casting type for and those that weren't. So those scripts that were used for imperial correspondence and bureaucracy, etc., those were worth transforming into printed scripts with all the changes that entailed, which I'll explain in a minute. Those that were used by cultures that were deemed to be less important or even potentially oppositional to the bureaucracy of the British Raj would not be affected by printing because they would never cast type for them. So at that point, this divergence began to take place. And let's have a look at what that entailed. So first of all, it meant that a dominant script, let's say one of the principal scripts of India, was allied with authority. It became authoritative in a way that was often secular because we're talking about an administration, an imperial administration. Secondly, as I've said, it's one that became affected by the introduction of new technologies. At the time, printing, but then subsequently digital technologies, because the more likely a script was to be printed, the more likely it was subsequently to be digitized. It became associated with capital and investment because printing presses are expensive. And it's only worth investing that capital if you feel that relationship with that culture is important enough. So writing then becomes writing in the sense of writing/printing, becomes an agent of power and commerce. Because it's being printed, that means that you also start developing centralization and uniformity of styles. So you now have a Gujarati font, for example, or typeface as it would have been, rather than a bunch of different people who are all writing in the Gujarati script in their own particular hands. And in fact, so therefore power and commerce become associated with centralization and uniformity. This also means that the letters themselves change because, and Pippa was talking about this earlier, the mechanism for creating them is changing. So when you have metal type, you can have right angles, you can have sharp edges, you can have symmetries. And then subsequently you have vinyl cutting, and all of these are affecting the way we see writing, the way we understand writing. So I was fortunate enough to be in southern India in the early 2000s, and a lot of shops and stalls would have signage that was handwritten. And of course, nowadays, that would have changed, and it certainly would have changed in the West, where a sign of professionalism and also power, commerce, etc., is that it is printed or engraved or vinyl cut. And so what you're doing is you're starting to get the identity of handwriting changing. It's starting to be marginalized as print and similar mechanistic forms become more prioritized. It also means that you can have industrialization of production and distribution of things like signage or books or billboards, for example. And then one which is, I think, of particular interest and concern to me is that when a script becomes mechanized or digitized, because of everything that I've just said, it also tends to become secularized. And we'll look at some examples of that in a minute. Here, for example, thanks to Jade, who is present with us, is a great photograph of a Dongba priest writing in the Dongba script. And this as a script that was developed specifically for use by priests, typically taught only to their apprentices on a one-to-one basis. And each individual actuation of a character, the writing of it, the reading of it, the seeing of it, was part of a sacred relationship and purpose. Here is the Dongba script being used on a signage for a Starbucks. And so once you have the ability to create and mechanize and transport in this fashion, you then secularize the script in terms of purpose and in terms of identity. And to me, that is a huge, huge issue and one worth thinking about. So what this means then is that two things, the two sides of the same coin. A minority script is far more likely to be written by hand. And even if we now have a font or a Unicode version of it, it's more likely to be based on a handwriting style. But conversely, handwriting is increasingly a minority activity. So one of the things that I do in my madness is that if I see something that's handwritten in public, I take a photograph of it, because it's almost invariably a sign of some kind of aberration. So when I was still living in the US and I was commuting across the lake to Burlington, all day, the only handwritten thing I would see would be a sign on the wall of the ferry toilet, which would say, "You make a mess, you clean it up." And so the identity of handwriting is changing kind of under our noses, whether we recognize it or not. But it has been changing now, certainly for a century or more, in ways that are so subtle that, for example, in the English language, when we say writing, as in I read somebody's writing, we can't tell whether they mean writing by hand or printing. There are other languages where there are actually different words for those two. So people still see a distinction, but we are losing that distinction because so much of the writing we see is actually printed or delivered in some mechanical fashion. So what is the evidence then of the decline or the undermining of handwriting? So I'm going to give you a couple of examples. So in my book By Hand, I talk about this documentary that I saw, a video documentary made essentially by a branch of the Indian government and Tourist Bureau. And the way in which it talks about handwriting, and specifically, this is a newspaper that is handwritten in Urdu using the Nazdalik script. The narrator talks about handwriting as an expression of a bygone era, striving to stay alive in this time and space of technology, a desperate attempt to resuscitate a tradition, etc., etc. And it's no surprise that the writer and narrator of this documentary is young. And so there is a sense written into, literally, the narrative that handwriting, especially this specialized form of handwriting, is a thing of the past. And here is actually what a handwritten Nazdalik newspaper looks like. It's an artifact of extraordinary beauty and extraordinary labor. You can tell from the complexity and non-linearity of the script, the fact that it has such really interesting spacing and vertical intervals, that it doesn't really conform to our notions of what printing ought to look like. It doesn't use space very efficiently. And I'm afraid I have to report that during the pandemic, this newspaper called The Mussulman in Chennai finally went under, or rather went over, and is now typeset. Second example I want to give you is from the United States. So right at the end of 2024, the Smithsonian, which is an institution consisting of a number of specific museums and sub-institutions, put out this appeal. You can transcribe. So it was an appeal to people who can still read handwriting. And they make it sound very kind of civic-minded and even sexy and adventurous in the way they present it. And they appeal to people to become citizen archivists. So I've got a whole chapter about this in By Hand. And the point was that they have millions upon millions of handwritten documents that they are concerned that the average user of their archives can't read. And so what they're looking for is people to either transcribe them or at the very least to index them. And I thought this is something I've got to get involved in. I'm writing this book by hand about handwriting. And so I signed up to take part in this enterprise. And this was March, April of 2025. And it was not at all what it seemed. But what became clear instantly, given that particular moment in history, was exactly how important an enterprise it is. Because one of the areas, for example, where they were looking for help with transcription and indexing was records about Japanese Americans relocated during World War II. And that doesn't mean that World War II was 1988 to 1989. It just means these particular batch of records date from there. So in other words, this was evidence of internment and of systemic racism carried out by the American government during World War II. At that very time, the Trump administration was changing the representation of American history and American rights on the web. Every governmental organization that had evidence of outstanding participation and great deeds by women or people of color, those were taken off the web. They were taken down. The looting and rewriting of the historical document was taking place in America, even as the Smithsonian was appealing for people who could help preserve these historical documents. And the fact is that internment is something that every American child should learn about. There should be documents such as these. For example, what did happen to their clothing? What happened to their possessions? There are individual receipts and documents about that. It's fascinating stuff and just very disturbing. But this is exactly, of course, what people can no longer read because it's handwritten. And so I was completely torn by this because on the one hand, I thought, you know, if these records are in fact transcribed and made public, then the government may actually decide, wait a second, we don't want those public, and they may make them vanish. So it was an enterprise that highlighted how important the handwritten record is in civic life and cultural history. And by the way, here's one particular document that I found in this section. And you may have difficulty reading it because, like many of these documents, it has faded over time. It was written quite quickly, and it's written by one of the people involved in the internment to the FBI. And it basically says, here's the list as it was presented to Commanding General Finley in 1942. We have not been advised what action will be taken. So they didn't even know why they were making these records of all of these actions of internment. And to me, this is just a fabulous example, both of how important handwriting is and was, and how important it is that it is now so endangered that the Smithsonian is having to call for volunteers to transcribe this stuff. So let's move out of the United States and find another piece of evidence of the of handwriting as an endangered alphabet. And it comes from Denmark, which is a country that is in the news for a very different reason right now. But what I just discovered was that PostNord, which is the Danish postal service, has stopped delivering letters. Now, one of the really interesting and important things, as I've already stressed, is in order to preserve handwriting, you have to see handwriting. And one of the ways in which you see handwriting is if people write letters to each other. We've been talking throughout the day about postcards and exchanges by handwriting. And PostNord has decided it will no longer deliver letters. And so they actually posted this graph which showed the decline, the 90% decline in letter volumes. And here is, I think, a really important point. So you could look at this and you could say, it's true, I don't write letters anymore, I send emails. This all has to do with the development of technology, and letter writing is now a technology that's becoming obsolete. And I'm going to suggest a different way of interpreting this. I'm going to ask the question, is this decline in the number of letters due to the increase in digital communications, or because of the desire to privatize mail and delivery services and make a small number of people a large number of profit? And in case that sounds cynical, that is exactly what is happening in the United States, where the person who is in charge of the US Postal Service actually has significant investments in private delivery services. And of course, we all know that the people who benefited financially most from the pandemic were people who were involved in private mail and delivery services. So this is not just a technological issue. This is also an issue of profit. Second side note, it's worth noting that writing has traditionally been accomplished using cheap or even free available materials and tools as a manual act or art. When I was becoming a professional writer in the early 1980s, I could buy everything I needed to be a professional writer for roughly half a day's earnings. We are entering the era in which writing is now an expensive product and service commodity requiring specialized materials and considerable upfront investment. So, for example, Microsoft Word, if you want to use Microsoft Word, $249.99 or best offer. Okay, my best offer is $10. Nobody ever got rich by selling me a number 2 pencil or a ballpoint pen. Writing has now become a profitable enterprise. And the reason we see writing identified with technology more and more and more is because the people who make money off-writing technologies want us to think of it in those terms. And they want us to think, ooh, I mustn't get ahead of myself. Just 1 second. So when I was writing by hand, one of the most revealing pieces of research I did was I stumbled upon a short video episode made by the BBC video news service. And I need to explain this in some detail because it's a story that reveals a great deal about what's going on right now. So the segment begins with a reporter saying, I have terrible handwriting. I hate my handwriting. If I could get somebody to write my writing for me, I would be the happiest man on earth. And he said, and now I can. And he started speaking about one of a number of available technologies. This particular one was called Hemingway. And again, I talk about this in my book by hand. And what Hemingway would do is it would scan something that the reporter had written by hand. It would train its mechanical pen to write in this fashion. And then it would write anything that he wanted it to write in this facsimile of his handwriting. And he was the reporter, and of course the president of the company who was being interviewed was saying, isn't this a wonderful thing? This arduous task of handwriting, especially me handwriting in my hideous handwriting, has now been taken over by this wonderful machine, which is going to cost you, I think it was about $1,700, but I don't remember exactly. But here is the point. In order to test this, the reporter did a creditable job of bringing in a handwriting expert, a graphologist. And what he got was not exactly what he expected. So he showed the graphologist a sheet of paper with his handwriting and a sheet of paper with the handwriting of this machine, Hemingway, and said, can you tell the difference? And the graphologist said, well, yes, and immediately pointed out that the one that was written by the machine looked mechanical. So, for example, every time there was a letter N, it looked like the same letter N. And he said, it looks stiff, it lacks soul, it lacks life, it's dead. But then he said the thing that the reporter had not expected. He said, I imagine him turning to the reporter and saying, by the way, you have lovely handwriting. He said, it's creative, it's full of life. You do this with this letter and this with this letter. And the reporter was gobsmacked because nobody had ever told him that he had nice handwriting. So that really leads to the next issue, which is the role of shame. So it only occurred to me as I was writing this in the book that virtually everybody I interviewed about their handwriting said, I've got terrible handwriting. In fact, they spoke about their handwriting in terms that were bitter and profound and shameful. 4 different people said, I have been told I have the handwriting of a serial killer, even though I actually saw their handwriting. They're all completely different handwriting. So it clearly is a stigma issue. And so when you think about it, you kind of go, in whose interest is it for us to believe that our handwriting is unacceptable, is shameful, is not only slow and inefficient, but is something that we don't want to appear in public wearing? And the answer is, it's in the interest of somebody who's then going to get us to spend $249.99 on software that will make their handwriting look professional. And I was so, even I myself was so caught up in this spiral of shame that at one point I decided I was going to start this thing called the slow writing movement, where the analogy obviously being to the slow food movement, where you recognize that something good takes time and experience and slowness and reflection. And so I decided I would make up a postcard that said the slow writing movement. And every time I gave a talk, I would pass these postcards out and I would have people write in their handwriting and send them back to me. And the problem was I couldn't write it in a way that I wasn't ashamed of. So I actually made 32 attempts to write the slow writing movement, and I hated every one of them. And eventually I actually did a collage of all of them to say, I can't do this. And my own dislike of my handwriting was so great, I actually started developing anxiety symptoms that were like heart attacks, and I wound up in the hospital. So this business of shame and how people feel about their handwriting in this year of grace 2026 is inextricably connected, especially in the United States, to the development and sale of technologies that will take handwriting literally out of our hands. So this is what my handwriting looked like when I started writing by hand. And it's understandable, for 20 years, I had been doing journalism. I had been scribbling, I'd been taking stuff down as fast as I possibly could. And it was rubbish. And if you want to see how my writing turned out by the end of the book, and you want to ask, how did I make that transformation? You'll have to buy the book. So I apologize now to anybody who took part in our by hand book club last week, where we actually practiced this exercise about giggling, or specifically about writing the word giggling. And this came about because my last event in the United States before I left at the beginning of this year was a workshop in Arlington, Vermont, in a small library, pretty well attended. And when it began, everybody there was a little on edge and was a little unhappy, I would say, because I was talking about handwriting, and every single person there, 15 people, said, I have terrible handwriting. So I said to them, I want you to write one word. You can write it, you can practice writing it several times. The librarian passed out, spiral bound notebooks and pencils and whatnot. I want you to write the word giggling. And I chose the word giggling because what I had noticed was that if you're writing by hand and you write a word that contains the same letter more than once, you're going to write it differently, because the process of writing is agglutinative or combinatory. You're not just putting down individual letters, you are coalescing them into words at the same time as you're also moving across the page. And so sure enough, when I wrote the word giggling, what I found was that the final G, for some reason, always came back under, as if I were trying to underline or loop together the word as a whole. And the initial G was always different, because there was a sense that here we go, here's how the word starts. And what happened in this meeting in the library was that everybody wrote the word a few times. And I said, now I want you to look at each other's. And the atmosphere in the room changed dramatically and instantly, because instead of people judging their own writing and saying, this is not good, this is bad, etc., they were now seeing multiple people's writing. And what happened was that they started saying, oh, you write your G like this, I did mine like this, or, oh, you do your dot above the I, my dot will never go above the I. In other words, they instinctively recognized that writing was their own. Instead of thinking this is how you should do it, which of course is how we're all taught to write, they were thinking this is how I do it. This is now something that is an extension of my own. And they were happy. They started laughing and talking and pointing things out, and they went on and on. I had to stop them. This went on for like 10 minutes. And they were having such a great time rediscovering writing as a personal act, as opposed to writing as a product. Now, it's a sign of how much my subject is in the air, but also a sign of how much I'm looking for it, that only today I was walking around Cambridge. I'm looking at Pippa to see if she can imagine what's coming next. I was walking around Cambridge, and what should I see but a Thai restaurant called the Giggling Squid. And I'm thinking, first of all, that is a fabulous name for a restaurant. But, here it is in printed form. And in printed form, apart from the initial G, all of the G's are identical. No matter what you do with the typeface, and this is not a bad typeface, this is kind of a fun typeface, you are presenting the notion of uniformity. Remember, right back at the beginning, I said that the thing that has come to identify a dominant script is our belief in its uniformity. But things then got even more interesting, because having taken this photograph, I meandered around and found myself at the back of the same restaurant, where on the windows, they have had tons of fun writing it in a script-based font. And now you kind of go, wait a second, no, those two G's or the three G's are absolutely not identical. They're not even on a level, and one is below and one is above. And you sort of go, this is just a beautiful illustration of how much fun writing can be, even when it's being produced in this mechanical form and slapped on the window of the restaurant. So why is handwriting important? And what is at stake here in handwriting becoming an endangered alphabet? So this is actually a photograph by Kalajatra, who we were talking about not that long ago. This is two young Nepalese women who have written their names in the Ranjana script. And they are at one of these pop-up workshops I was talking about, and they are so happy. This is the script that was banned for 100 years. Anybody found writing in this script could be imprisoned and have all of their possessions taken away. So what they have done is to reconnect with that pre-ban ancestry. They've kind of relocated themselves in the history of their people. And this is another one. This is a Kulitan script from the Philippines. And again, it's a workshop where people are getting to write their own names in their own script and are super happy doing it. And I want to show you a different illustration, again, from me wandering around Cambridge, of how true this is, even with the Latin alphabet. So I wandered over to the market a couple of days ago, and it was raining, and there weren't that many people around. And the used book stall, the proprietor was sitting there, and he was writing prices in a bunch of books that had just come in. And I immediately, of course, went over and started talking to him. And what he told me was that he had inherited this stall from his father. His father had either died or retired not that long ago. And here he was sitting with his collar turned up in, at the edge of the rain, just barely under the awning. And as he is writing the prices of these books that he is now going to try and sell, he realized that some of them had been sold by his father because he recognized his father's handwriting. Specifically, he recognized the way his father did a pound sign. And actually, one of the books, he saw that his father had sold it. It was £2. He decided that this was archaic and he needed to introduce some degree of inflation. And so he added a dot and a 50. So he pushed the price up. But his handwriting was now so much like his father's that no one would ever know that he had added that price. And he said something really interesting. He said, "The longer I work here, the more I write my pound sign like my father did." And if you look at it, it's actually a very idiosyncratic pound sign. There's a vertical stroke, there's a kind of a hook tail, and then there's the two horizontals. Not how I would write a pound sign, certainly. But it seems to me that this is just a fabulous illustration of the way in which handwriting has meaning, and Pippa and I were talking about this earlier, that goes so far beyond the mere communication of data or information. This is something where he is, in essence, constantly relocating himself in his life, in his family's life, in his father's life. Speaking of which, this is a totally different form of handwriting. This is batok, which is traditional Philippine tattooing. And it's done with a stick with a thorn pushed through it. And thorn is dipped in ink, and then you tap on the stick with a different stick and you leave a pattern of dots, which looks like this. And again, I talk about this in by hand. And originally, by the way, one of the most significant culturally purposes of this tattooing, this batok, was to indicate that you had successfully headhunted an enemy. So talk about writing steeped in tradition. And I asked Christiane about the effect of the act of writing. Not the substance, not the actual inking, but what it was like for people to be tattooed. And he said, "I think of it as the spirituality of your ancestors." He says, some people just want a recording of the tapping sound. It puts them in a trance. I've definitely had some people, whether atheist, Christian, Buddhist, whatever, say they've had a spiritual experience with this practice. Tattooing is one of those visceral things. You can experience the same thing, the same pain. Your ancestors did thousands of years ago. The posture, the same type of pain, the same bone tools. I can't think of anything else that would have felt exactly the same 1,000 years ago that hasn't changed. So my final wrap up, again, this is from my Tales of Wandering Around Cambridge, has to do with accents, an analogy between handwriting and accents. I find it very interesting that linguists have left behind the notion that there is a right way and a wrong way to speak, and received standard British English is no longer seen as being superior to regional English, for example. And I think there's a really important analogy to be made between accents and handwriting. So in the first 4 days after arriving in Cambridge, which is a remarkably multicultural town, I had conversations with people who are talking in the following accents: Kurdish, Sri Lankan, Polish, Egyptian, Gujarati, Ukrainian, Jordanian, Iranian, Lithuanian, Bengali, Armenian, Chinese, and Japanese. And the cumulative effect of hearing people talking in so many different varieties of English with these accents was that you stop thinking of them as accents. They are simply people talking. In the same way that when the people in the library in Arlington started seeing how everybody wrote differently, they stopped thinking of it in terms of right and wrong. This is just the way we write. There is a really important neurological element here. Not only do your ears become better attuned to these varieties and your ability to take in and understand them, but your sense of what spoken English is becomes broader and richer. And the same is true of handwriting. If you only ever see a G a certain way, then you lose the ability to process the complexities of the varieties of writing that people practice. Instead, you say things like, I can't read it, it's in cursive. And that's a kind of a shorthand, which means I have lost the ability to process complex visual information. Finally, when you hear people talking in all these accents, or when you read people's writing, you lose that hierarchical sense of right and wrong, of better and worse. You're simply in the midst of a diverse, colorful assortment of people who are making their way through life. Quote from Ralph Waldo Emerson, "A foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds." In case you don't know this word, I want to introduce you to it. Stultification comes from the Latin stultus, right? Meaning stupid. And stultification means how we make ourselves stupid. And the way we make ourselves stupid is by simplifying and reducing the range of inputs to which we are exposed. And my belief is that the future of writing depends on what we think writing actually is. If we think writing is a technology, and we talked about this earlier today, the temptation is to say, oh, we can find superior technologies, we can find more efficient technologies, faster technologies. If, on the other hand, we think of writing as a manual act or a manual art, then all of a sudden, the future of writing becomes far more interesting. Who will win in terms of definition is a different question, because the billions of dollars are on the side of defining writing as a technology. But one of the reasons why we have this conference today and why we have the By Hand Book Club is to think about what value we gain when we write by hand and what we lose when we don't. And so I want to give one last plug to my book By Hand, which you can find at endangeredalphabets.com/byhand. I would absolutely invite you to join our By Hand Book Club, where we meet every Sunday. And we talk about such things. And again, if you go to endangeredalphabets.com and you click on the blog link, you'll see the blog post about the By Hand Book Club. We are just about, other books of mine you could buy, should you want to. We're just about out of time here, but we have a few minutes left for questions. I am going to stop sharing screen, and I would love to hear questions and comments and accents. Yes, Mo.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Tim. I was actually thinking myself this morning, what you're going to talk about, but it's a bit more interesting. I will tell you something, I use the KinoScribe a lot for writing Kikaku and all my scrap stuff over the years, because I think it's gathers it in one place and it's easy to find. Anyway, but I bought a KinoScribe for my daughter. She is doing sciences in A-level. And a few months ago, she told me, get me a blackboard. And I said, why do you need a blackboard? You get a KinoScribe. And I said, no, I remember more when I actually write it.
Exactly.
There you are.
Yep. And in fact, this has been proven, neurological studies over and over again. There were two articles in Scientific American about this. One of them was in, I think, 2013. The other one was last year. And the only difference between the two articles was the second one quoted all of the research from the first one and said, all of this research has been repeated since then. The only surprising thing about it is that nobody is listening. Yes, but I have to say that yesterday I was sitting next to a student in a cafe in Cambridge, and she was in fact taking all of her notes by hand so that she could retain it better and understand it better. Thank you. Okay, who's up next? Nino, yeah, jump in.
Hello again. And I'll have to condense everything I would like to say right now because this is so fascinating and at the same time harrowing to think about the future of writing, which for me personally is something deeply important. And yeah, it is very sad and this cynical point of view is sadly very true. But I had two little comments. One on one of the things you said first about this appeal from Smithsonian, yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Because even though I agree with everything you said about this, and also, well, it's your area of expertise. I was curious about how they really, how they formulated that appeal. Was it really a literal statement that they found that most of the users of the archive can't read handwriting, or was it more of a push to transcribe the documents so they would be more easily searchable, for example?
Great question. The whole thing is still going on. They don't stand a snowball's chance in hell of digitizing or transcribing or anything. All of those documents, there's so many. But yes, I would suggest you go to the National Archives website. And it's what is really interesting to me is how they do their very best to make this process, which is important and difficult, sound sexy and fun. So they actually, when they're training you, they offer you a series of subject areas because they don't want people to think, oh, archives boring. And so one of the subject areas they invite you to train on is UFO sightings. And another one is submarine warfare. And you're kind of going, they're doing their best to really show the most kind of exciting aspect of this. And when you actually get into the documents, not only are they really hard to read and very faded but they're typically also very, very they're minutiae. They're very dull, you know. So within the internment of Japanese Americans, for example, there'll be a receipt for a pair of shoes or something like that. And it's important that we have that. But if you were to say to people, join this enterprise to transcribe receipts for pairs of shoes, nobody would ever do it. Anyhow, but yes, it's a fascinating and paradoxical issue, and it's one that, as I say, what is going on right now in terms of the obliteration of history by the American government makes it all the more important.
So the other thing, your last slide, or one of the last slides, where you proposed two ways to think about writing.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And you said that you see a better future for writing in if it's interpreted as art, but also I feel like this can be a bit of a trap where several technologies that people viewed as a part of their everyday life are now still endangered because they've been reduced to arts in the sense that they're not needed in an everyday life anymore. So they're sometimes there's now much more of a focus on artistry over function, but the price for that is the loss of its presence in everyday life. And I feel like this still can apply to writing, even if it's preserved as a form of art.
That is a brilliant point, and you're right. It is a trap. If something is safely marginalized as an art form, not only, as you say, can it be dismissed from everyday functionality, you can also make people pay more money for it. So, you can charge people. I found a fountain pen that was going for $8,500, for example. I actually said was that a manual act and or a manual art. So really, it has more to do with what we bring to the act of writing than what the writing becomes as a function in society. So when I write now, I write in my journal, I use my good pen, and I try and bring my best self to the act of writing. And it gives value to me, it gives value to the writing, it may give value to anybody who reads it. And that has transformed all the writing that I do, even if all I'm doing is making a quick note to myself or trying to scribble something on the back of an envelope. My understanding of writing has changed and has expanded to such a degree that it's not as if I'm saying, oh, yes, let's create a culture of calligraphers and let's let them do the good writing and we'll all do stuff, in a more functional fashion. Which, as you say,
that's what I would be afraid of, because
exactly.
to a degree, this is already a thing. For example, when people want handwritten invitations for their weddings, they hire someone to calligraph them. But it doesn't make it more of a everyday thing.
Yes, one of the next conferences or discussions I'm going to organize is going to ask the question, what is the role of the calligrapher in the future of writing? Because in one way, calligraphy has this wonderful ability to connect us to our cultural roots. But then there are other forms of calligraphy, such as the stuff that Alice does, for example, who's, with us, which are experimental and expressive and expand the role of writing and the nature of writing and encourage people to participate in much more varied ways in the act of writing. So I think that's going to be a really interesting discussion if and when we ever pull it off. But I hear Pippa thinking at me, we're out of time. So yes, thank you so much, Nino, for those thoughts and those questions. Thanks to everybody who stuck it out while I talked for an hour, which is always an iffy proposition. I'm going to pass the microphone, so to speak, back over to Pippa for our next event.